Grandpa was 73, wiry and stubborn, the kind of man who had grown up believing the world owed him nothing and that common sense was worth more than rules printed on paper. For decades, he had lived on the edge of Willow Creek Estates, a supposedly exclusive HOA neighborhood that prided itself on perfection, pruned lawns, white picket fences, and the illusion that everything belonged to them. Grandpa didn't care for illusions. He cared about the old things, the things that mattered: his late wife's garden, the sound of the creek that ran behind his property, and his small, private lake that he had fished since he was a boy. The lake had been in the family for over 100 years, long before the HOA had built its manicured roads and surveillance cameras. It was early Saturday morning, just after dawn, when Grandpa grabbed his wooden fishing pole, a bucket, and a small tackle box. The air smelled of wet leaves and morning dew, and the sun spilled across the lake like molten gold. He walked past the HOA's warning signs, past the gated entrance that said, "Private property, residents only," and settled onto his favorite fishing dock. The wooden planks creaked beneath his weight, but Grandpa didn't care. This was his sanctuary. For 30 minutes, he sat in peace. Birds called across the water, a gentle breeze rippled the surface, and Grandpa's line hung lazily in the lake. His mind wandered back to childhood summers, when he and his friends would race to the water's edge, laughing as they skipped rocks and swatted mosquitoes. Those were the days before overzealous bylaws, before HOA patrols and petty complaints. Now, the world had grown rigid, and rules had replaced joy. But Grandpa had never been one to bow to rules that didn't make sense. He had seen too much bureaucracy, too many people who acted like they owned the world, and he had survived by doing exactly what made sense to him, not what someone with a clipboard dictated. His only regret was that his neighbors, the ones who had recently moved in from the city and had no understanding of life beyond taxes and tamed lawns, were convinced that every inch of water, every blade of grass, belonged to their HOA overlords. At precisely 7:12 a.m., his peace was shattered. A black SUV rumbled down the gravel road, tires crunching over loose stones. Two men in matching khaki uniforms stepped out, badges glinting in the morning sun. They didn't knock. They didn't ask. They just walked straight onto Grandpa's property, hands on their hips, surveying the scene like they were inspecting a crime scene. "Sir," one of them barked, "you're not allowed to fish here. This lake is part of Willow Creek Estates HOA. Private property." Grandpa squinted at them, his lined face settling into a calm but firm frown. "I don't belong to your HOA," he said. "This lake has been in my family for generations. I pay taxes on this property. I fish here every week, rain or shine. You're 5 minutes too late to lecture me." The men looked confused, flipping through their clipboards, muttering into radios. "Private lake," they repeated, as if chanting a spell that would give them authority over decades of history. Grandpa didn't move. He didn't even pull in his line. He just leaned back, adjusting his hat, and waited. Within moments, a neighbor had called the HOA headquarters. Within 5 minutes, a squad car arrived, lights flashing silently, as if announcing the arrival of authority itself. But Grandpa wasn't fazed. He had faced bureaucrats before, lawyers before, and greedy city officials before. This was just another Monday, disguised as an early Saturday. The squad car parked awkwardly at the edge of his driveway, and two uniformed officers stepped out, pens poised to write citations for trespassing or whatever violation the HOA could dream up. Grandpa waved at them, smiling faintly. "Morning, gentlemen. Care for a cup of coffee?" The officers paused, caught off guard by his calm demeanor. They weren't used to respect from the people they were about to find, and Grandpa knew this. He had prepared for it, not with confrontation, but with patience, with strategy, with the knowledge that rules without context could crumble in moments if exposed properly. The tension was electric. HOA enforcers and city officers glared at Grandpa's dock, but the man on the planks didn't flinch. He reeled in a fish, held it up to the light, and released it back into the water. Every step he took was deliberate, measured, as if he were telling them without words that he knew exactly what he was doing, and that their threats were meaningless. The first seeds of panic began to sprout in the enforcers' minds. A simple fishing trip had turned into a standoff with a man who refused to acknowledge their authority. They whispered among themselves, consulting phones, muttering about HOA rules and property rights. But Grandpa just sat there, smiling faintly. He knew something they didn't yet. The lake had secrets, and by the time they discovered them, it would be too late. The officers shifted uneasily, clearly out of their depth. One of them cleared his throat and spoke louder than necessary, as if volume could replace logic. "Sir, you need to leave the lake immediately. You are trespassing. This is HOA property. You are not authorized to fish here." Grandpa looked at him calmly, letting the words hang in the crisp morning air. He set his pole down and folded his arms. "Authorized? My great-grandfather owned this land when your HOA was just a dream on paper. This lake is mine, always has been. You're free to write all the tickets you like, but that won't change history." The officers exchanged nervous glances. One whispered into his radio, probably begging for backup or legal advice. But the HOA representative, a sharp woman named Karen W., stepped forward, her heels clicking on the gravel. She looked at Grandpa with the kind of disgust only someone who believed money equaled power could muster. "We have authority here," she said sharply. "You will comply, or we'll call the sheriff. This lake is off-limits to non-members. That's the rule." Grandpa's eyes twinkled with mischief. "The rule? Let me guess. The rule also says that a man cannot fish on his own property, that he must bow to strangers in uniform, and that decades of ownership are meaningless? Fascinating. And what happens if I refuse?" Karen smirked, thinking she had him cornered. "Then we enforce the law. Simple." Grandpa laughed softly, a deep, rolling sound that echoed over the water. "Enforce the law, you say? Let me ask you something. What exactly are you enforcing? Your HOA's budget? Your sense of self-importance? Or the fact that people like you think they can bully others without consequence?" Her smile faltered. The officers shifted nervously. Grandpa reached into his pocket and pulled out an old leather-bound folder. "I have every deed, every title, every historical record proving this lake has belonged to my family for generations. You want to see it?" Karen waved a hand dismissively, still trying to maintain authority. "We don't have time for your stories. Step off the dock, or we'll escalate this." Grandpa shook his head slowly, almost sorrowfully. "You don't understand. This lake isn't just water and fish. It's legacy. It's family. And you," he gestured to the HOA enforcers, "you think authority can trump history. But sometimes authority forgets one thing: consequences." The morning sun glinted off the lake, and Grandpa reached for his fishing pole again. He cast the line with a precision that came only from decades of practice. The water shimmered, rippling outward, but he didn't seem concerned with the HOA officers now. His attention was on something far bigger. "Are you serious?" Karen muttered under her breath. She had a tendency to underestimate older men, but Grandpa's calm presence was unnerving. The officers were sweating, fumbling with radios, unsure if calling for backup would help or make things worse. It was at that exact moment, 10 minutes into the confrontation, that a question shot through the tension like a lightning bolt. What could an old man with a fishing pole possibly have that could ruin the HOA in less than 5 minutes? The officers didn't answer. Karen froze mid-step. Grandpa simply smiled, reached into the water, and pulled out a metal box, slick with morning dew. He set it on the dock, clicked it open, and revealed dozens of envelopes and documents, each stamped with official city seals, contracts, and legal agreements. Karen's eyes widened. She leaned closer, reading aloud. "These are the filings for all the new luxury homes you're planning, and these water rights." She stopped, unable to finish. Grandpa nodded gently. "Exactly. Every single plot, every water right, every property line you've been trying to enforce illegally mine, all mine or mine to control. One wrong move, and your plans evaporate faster than morning fog." The officers looked at each other, their confidence evaporating. Grandpa's hand hovered over the stack of documents like a general ready to strike. "You see, Karen," he said softly, "rules exist for one purpose: to prevent chaos. But when people ignore history, ignore truth, and assume power they do not possess, the chaos comes to them. Karen's face turned red, not with anger, but with panic. You can't, this isn't legal, she stammered. Grandpa leaned closer, his voice calm but deadly. Oh, it's very legal. In fact, you just walked onto private property and tried to intimidate the rightful owner. That makes everything you've done today highly problematic for your HOA's future. The officers glanced at each other, unsure if they were witnesses or participants in a disaster waiting to happen. Grandpa's next move was deliberate. He pulled out his phone and dialed his lawyer. Hello, just confirming that yes, the HOA's property filings are being challenged, effective immediately. And yes, I do want emergency injunctions in place. Thanks. Karen's knees almost buckled. The officers swallowed hard. Grandpa leaned back, finally picking up his fishing pole again. Enjoy the view, he said, because by the time the lawyers arrive, it will be one you'll never forget. By the time the lawyer arrived, the neighborhood had already started to hum with a different kind of energy. What began as a sleepy Saturday had been transformed into a scent of panic, a soft electric buzz that traveled faster than any HOA email ever could. A few neighbors drifted to the edge of their driveways, phones out, whispering. The HOA board, who had strutted around in their little robes of imagined authority for months, found themselves scrambling like actors whose script had just been stolen. Grandpa's lawyer was a woman named Priya Singh, a no-nonsense litigator with a reputation for turning tiny technicalities into public spectacles. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone who'd spent years reading deeds by lamplight and winning against men who thought money equaled invincibility. She stepped onto the dock, took one measured look at the metal box of documents, and then at Karen and the men in khaki, and did something those men did not expect. She smiled, not cruelly, but with the kind of calm that means you are already 3 moves ahead. Karen, Priya said without preamble, we're filing a notice of lease pendens on any development plans and liens on any improvements until title is quieted. We're also requesting an immediate temporary restraining order to halt any HOA enforcement activities on this property and an emergency injunction preventing any transfer of these disputed parcels. She spoke legal phrases like someone naming conjured spirits, and the effect was almost the same. Corridors of power shivered. Karen's face went paper pale. She didn't understand most of the legalese, but she knew what it meant. Interruption, delay, risk. She opened her mouth and then closed it, the perfect picture of someone watching their empire wobble. The officers had gone from confident to tentative. They hovered like guests at a party that had turned into a funeral. Within hours, Priya had filed the necessary paperwork. The clerk stamped the documents and handed copies to an assistant. A judge signed a temporary restraining order that same afternoon, binding the HOA and any affiliated developers from any further action on Grandpa's Lake or the surrounding disputed parcels. The local paper's reporter, sensing a juicy human interest piece, arrived and started asking questions. One video clip of Grandpa, framed against the rippling water and the scolding faces of the HOA enforcers behind him, went viral in the county within the day. But lawyers and courts were only part of the assault. Priya knew, as all effective litigators do, that money made the world turn more reliably than words. She also knew how developers and HOA boards worked. They floated plans, they secured bridge loans, they sold visions to investors who signed checks based on clean title reports and quick closures. Mess with the title and the money evaporates. That was the lever she pulled. Priya sent a terse, impeccably worded letter to the developers' council and the bank that had agreed to lend on the construction of the luxury homes slated around the lake. The letter set out, point by point, with attached certified copies of the historical deeds, an 1889 survey, and the newly filed lease pendens, that the title for the contested lots was disputed and that there were clear indications of prior ownership, recorded easements in favor of Grandpa's family, and an environmental covenant protecting the lake as a heritage resource. The culprits, she implied, had either failed to do due diligence or worse, knowingly ignored clouded title. Either way, the bank's exposure was immediate. Banks do not like exposure. Banks like certainty, Clean paperwork, predictable ROI. Within 48 hours, the lender sent a terse email to the developer. Funding is on hold pending resolution of title and clearances. The developer, who had already purchased materials, committed contractors, and advertised pre-sales, suddenly faced a freeze. Contractors required deposits returned. Subcontractors demanded payment. Marketing campaigns screeched to a halt. The sales team fielded cancellations as nervous buyers, spooked by headlines, pulled back. Karen tried to spin it into a PR argument, composing a memo about due process and community standards, but the narrative had slipped from her control. Social media favored Grandpa, an elderly man defending a family legacy against a faceless property board, and with every sympathetic share, the HOA's image dimmed. Local conservation groups smelled an opportunity and sent letters demanding environmental assessments and enforcement of the Heritage Covenant that Grandpa's document suggested. A state representative called the county attorney asking for a briefing. The county attorney called the bank. The bank tightened its jaw. Money is not merely numbers in a spreadsheet, it is confidence, rhythm, belief. Once those are gone, the numbers begin to compress into losses. The developer's bridge loan included penalty clauses if construction didn't begin by a set date. With the bank's hold, the developer faced contractual breaches, penalty payments, and the prospect of refunding pre-sale deposits plus statutory interest. Investors privately estimated their exposure, and the figure that leaked into a hastily circulated memo was ugly. Somewhere in the neighborhood of $2 million in sunk costs, penalties, and devalued pre-sales if the delays persisted. $2 million is enough to make people change their strategies. It is also, importantly, enough to send previously courageous people scurrying to avoid personal liability. The HOA board, which had been operating under the illusion it could bully around neighbors with impunity, suddenly found itself in the bright, cold glare of potential civil liability. Individual board members received personal letters from counsel warning them of claims for trespass, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and punitive damages. Homeowners who had written angry, vindictive emails found themselves embarrassed as those emails were subpoenaed and threatened to be used in litigation as evidence of malice. The board's defense evaporated into legal fees and frantic meetings. Karen's calls went unanswered by the developer, who now faced a funding freeze. Volunteers who had once agreed to act as community marshals quietly declined further participation. No one wanted their names tied to a lawsuit that might cost them personally. Board member families whispered about the cost of counsel and the potential loss of their reputations. Meetings that had previously been punctuated by petty rulemaking now centered on damage control and the looming possibility of significant payouts. Meanwhile, Grandpa walked the lake each evening as if nothing had changed. He took his time, casting lines, watching sunsets, and letting the authorities and lawyers do their work for him. He didn't gloat. He didn't rub his victory in anyone's face. Instead, he was dignified, the kind of man who understood that justice, when it comes, ought to be delivered with restraint. The community that had once laughed at him began, reluctantly, to respect him. And as the days ticked by, the financial damage crystallized into cold, hard reality. The developer issued a statement admitting delays and citing unforeseen title issues. Pre-sales dropped, contractors filed claims for demobilization costs, and on the balance sheet that ultimately mattered most to the HOA and its backers, the tally read roughly $2 million in lost value, penalties, and irrecoverable expenses tied directly to the halted project. Karen stared at the number as if it were an accusation. The HOA board, which had sought to expand and monetize the neighborhood's water resources for profit, was now on the hook for reputational and financial damage. The very rules they had used to bully others had created the conditions of their ruin. And as investigators began to dig deeper into the filings that Grandpa had produced, it became clear the HOA's paperwork was sloppier than anyone had admitted. Improper plats, missing notarizations, and a series of ignored historical easements layered together into a perfect legal storm. When the press returned, cameras rolling, Grandpa only said one thing to the microphone: "I wanted my lake back, not their money." But When people try to take what isn't theirs, they should be ready to pay for the consequences. His simplicity cut through the smoke of angry memos and legal citations. The county prosecutor, having watched how the HOA's intimidation tactics had escalated, opened an inquiry into potential abuses of power by private community enforcement groups. The developer's lender issued a cautious warning to any other communities trying similar shortcuts. By the time the neighborhood would be changed, people who had once cheered petty rule changes would think twice before signing off on legalistic overreach. Karen's position on the board would be untenable. The HOA's coffers would take a hit. But more than money, what Grandpa had reclaimed was respect, the preservation of a family legacy, and a reminder that authority that forgets history can be undone by it. The weeks after the confrontation felt surreal to the residents of Willow Creek Estates. What had begun as a minor skirmish over a private lake had ballooned into a financial and reputational catastrophe for the HOA. $2 million lost, countless legal headaches, and a viral story that spread across social media had humbled even the most arrogant board members. For Grandpa, however, life had returned to its natural rhythm. He still rose early, brewed his coffee, and walked to the lake, the air crisp with morning dew and the promise of calm waters. Fishing was no longer just a pastime. It had become a symbol of resilience, a quiet victory earned through patience, intelligence, and a refusal to yield to petty authority. Karen W., who had once walked the neighborhood with clipped heels and clipped words of command, now found herself under intense scrutiny. The HOA board had convened emergency meetings to assess the fallout, and the legal counsel they had hired was advising them to settle disputes quickly or risk further personal liability. The developers were still navigating the delays caused by Grandpa's strategic filings, and every missed construction milestone meant penalties stacking up like winter snow. Karen's confidence, once unshakable, now wavered with every phone call, every new legal notice, every investor inquiry she received. The community itself was in a state of transformation. Residents who had silently supported Karen's overreach found themselves facing the reality that blind obedience to rules could have real-world consequences. Some neighbors apologized quietly to Grandpa for believing the HOA's exaggerations, while others simply observed from a distance, unsure whether to align with him or remain neutral. Grandpa, ever the gentleman, acknowledged the apologies with a nod but never gossiped. He understood that true victory was not in humiliation, but in restoring balance. Grandpa's family rallied around him during this period, inspired by his calm determination and the elegance of his strategy. His grandchildren, who had watched him handle the situation with a mix of awe and disbelief, began to understand the lessons he had tried to teach them over the years: patience, persistence, and the importance of knowing your rights. They spent afternoons by the lake learning to fish, listening to his stories of past battles, and watching as the water reflected both sunlight and a legacy preserved against unreasonable authority. Meanwhile, Karen and the HOA board had begun to restructure, replacing aggressive enforcers with mediators, revising the language of bylaws, and instituting checks to prevent unilateral actions that could lead to similar disasters. Though the financial scars were permanent, the board slowly recognized the value of balance and fairness in governance. They realized that respect for long-standing property rights and historical precedent could prevent conflicts rather than escalate them. The lessons, while costly, would hopefully prevent similar situations in the future. Grandpa, however, never let the legal triumph change his demeanor. He fished when he wanted, walked his property freely, and occasionally shared a laugh with neighbors who had witnessed the chaos of the past month. The lake, calm and undisturbed, reflected his legacy back to him, a serene mirror of family history and justice. He knew the HOA would not forget this lesson anytime soon. Every new resident who moved into Willow Creek Estates would hear the story, a cautionary tale of what happens when authority forgets respect, history, and reason. One morning, as Grandpa cast his line under a soft golden sunrise, he paused to reflect on the events. The financial ruin, the viral attention, the legal battles, all had been necessary. But the outcome was more than just money lost or reputations tarnished. It was a reaffirmation of values, an acknowledgement that property, legacy, and patience held more power than arrogance and short sighted rules. He smiled quietly to himself, watching the water ripple, a reflection of peace restored. The HOA, chastened and humbled, had lost more than money. They had lost the illusion that control could be maintained through fear alone. Grandpa had not sought vengeance for its own sake, he had sought justice, and the balance had been restored. $2 million lost, the lake secured, the family legacy intact, and a neighborhood forever reminded of the lesson. Never underestimate the quiet strength of someone who knows their rights and refuses to be bullied. As the sun climbed higher, Grandpa reeled in a fish, held it up for a moment, and released it back into the sparkling water. He had won not through force, not through aggression, but through foresight, strategy, and the calm certainty of a man who had spent a lifetime understanding that sometimes the best revenge is simply justice done right. And in that quiet morning, by the lake that had weathered generations, Grandpa felt a profound peace knowing that the lake and his legacy would remain untouchable for years to come.